Please be seated. The court is back in session. The floor is once again given to the prosecution to continue putting questions to the expert. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Your Honours, Counsel, and good afternoon, Mr. Short. I hope your energy levels are high. We're going to go through quite a few more areas this afternoon. And again, I'm going to continue following the general structure and chronology of your book. We looked at the issue of a view of the city people as vermin, and we discussed the shelling of Phnom Penh. I want to turn to the next area that is in your book. And this was touched upon yesterday, so I'm going to try and be selective here. At page 255, where you describe the evacuation, the fall of Udong and its evacuation. Again, the event was discussed in some detail, so I'll ask you about one particular aspect which I don't think you've commented on. This is at ERN English 00396-455 and French 00639-784-5. And the quote is as follows. The population of the town, some 20,000 people, were rounded up and marched to the forest of Palel, an uninhabited area to the east of Trok Steppe, where Mok had a military base, before being resettled in cooperatives in the special zone and the southwest. Officials and uniformed soldiers were separated from the rest, led away and killed. I looked at the more detailed notes that you've provided to us for this page 255, and they indicate that your sources include an interview with Pipon, a book I believe authored by Diek, and conversations with villagers in the area in 2001, as well as a document that you abbreviate as RC. May 11, 1974. So my question there first is, have I got that right, that these are the primary sources, or these sources that you rely upon in describing the events, the interviews and these additional documents I've looked at?
Yes, that is correct. The interviews with Pipun, the conversations with villagers, they were two major sources. The written sources are RC is Reality Cambodienne, the weekly newspaper, weekly journal, and Diak is a book by an American military historian, Wilfred Diak.
Thank you. When you spoke to these villagers, were they people that had seen these events or experienced them and were describing them for you?
Yes.
Can I also ask you, if you recall, how many people you spoke to about this particular event? We're talking about the locally based people, if you recall.
I would find it difficult to answer that because I talked to a number of villagers about different topics. Some of them referred to this, some of them didn't. Certainly one or two spoke specifically about Udong. Whether there were more, I can't remember.
Thank you. In that passage, you indicate that officials and uniformed soldiers were separated from the rest, led away and killed. is that something that you see as consistent with policies and lines that we've discussed before, or is it an unusual event?
That is consistent with what had been happening before, what had started happening at least, and with, of course, what happened afterwards.
Thank you. I'd like to now, we might come back to Udong, but just for the moment, I might turn to the meeting you discussed with the judges yesterday, the 1974 Central Committee meeting, which I think you place at MIAC. And of course there you describe three key decisions decisions you characterize as key decisions that were made. Can I ask you first, it appears from your notes that P-Porn was a source for this meeting. Do you recall whether you also relied on other sources for its description? And let me say, before you answer, apart from confessions, I think there are confessions also referred to. Are there any other sources that you recall looking at?
My recollection is that meeting was only described by P-Porn. Whether the notes which you have give other sources, I could look, you could look, but P-Porn I remember as being the principal source.
Thank you. I'd like to now show you one of the documents that we've actually sent you a copy of. And this is E3/11. It's the Revolutionary Flag magazine from September 1977. Mr. President, with your permission, I have a copy with the relevant extract for the expert. It's one of the documents that we sent him with the Chamber's permission.
President, yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you deliver the document to the expert?
And just before I read that passage, as you may or may not, you probably are aware because we sent you a copy of a part of the transcript of P-Porn's testimony before this court. He described a meeting for the court of the Central Committee in MIAC, which I believe he dates in June or July. I think in the end he was of the view that it was June. And the reason I'm showing you this document is because it deals with meetings in that period, and I want to see whether that assists with understanding us whether we're dealing with the same events. So we're looking at Khmer ERN 000-63162, English 00486-247. So that should be page 36 in your copy, Mr. Short. And French 00492-836. And it says the following, about in the middle of the page, quote, "It was during this situation when our party's Central Committee, in the course of its June 1974 conference, resolved to mount the decisive offensive to liberate Phnom Penh and the entire country." If you're not quite sure on this, and rather you not speculate, is it possible this is the same event based on your research, or or are they two different Central Committee meetings?
This is certainly the same event. One of the difficulties with oral sourcing is that people may remember an event very clearly, but get the dating wrong. They can also conflate different events, but that didn't happen here. No, I missed this reference in Revolutionary Flag when I wrote the book. Certainly it's June 1974. Contemporary documents always are more reliable over chronology than people's memories.
Thank you. Now, of course, one of the three important decisions that you described was what you say was a unanimous decision that Phnom Penh and all of the other Cambodian towns should be evacuated as soon as they are liberated. And you've dealt with that, so I'm going to I won't ask you questions on that unless you wish to expand. I wanted to deal with the decision to execute, I believe, a Central Committee member whose name was Prasit. Now, you make the point that he's not the first CPK cadre to be liquidated, that Tamok had already eliminated a number of lower rank officials. But then you make the following point at page 260, and I will give the ERNs for that page in a moment. This is 00396-468 in English and 00639-791 in French. You say, this was the first time, however, that intra-party conflict had reached into the ranks of the Central Committee. It was the first time, too, that the party leadership had authorized the execution of one of its own member. Prasit's case was discussed at length during the plenum at Miek. Can I ask you to elaborate on the significance, as you describe it, of, if it is significant, of this being a decision in relation to a member, or it reaching the ranks of the Central Committee and being a decision about a senior member?
I think, in fact, we touched on this yesterday. I think it was extremely important. In any communist system, communist party, the decision to start purging within the leadership is a kind of tipping point. Happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in China very early on. And Prasit's case was the first in Cambodia. Because once you have accepted that, in inverted commas, counter-revolutionaries can worm their way into the leadership, as the consecrated phraseology has it, then you're opening the door to endless purges. So that was the first step, and it was very important.
And for the avoidance of any doubt, do I understand correctly that it was a decision, a collective decision, a decision accepted by people at that level, at least people that participated?
That is my understanding, and it is certainly the inference. It was discussed, and after the discussion, it happened. One may infer that there was agreement that it should happen.
Thank you. Now, I said we were going to return to Udong very briefly, and now I have another exhibit that I wish to show you. This is one of the revolutionary flags, again, that we sent you. This one is from December 1976 to January 1977. And, Mr. President, this is document E3/25. And as I said, it's a document that we sent a copy of to Mr. Short. And with your permission, I'll give him a copy with the specific extract.
President, yes, you may proceed. Court officer, could you assist by delivering the document for the expert's examination?
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, looking at this document, Mr. Short, the English translation has the passage I'm interested in at page 31, and that we've just given you that page. The ERNs are in Khmer 000-63039 to 40, French 00504-049 to 50, and English 00491-424. And what this passage deals with, essentially, is it appears a number of movements of people that took place before 1975. And I'll read a couple of the extracts from this. And it starts with, quote, attacking the enemy politically. Taking just one example, fighting to seize the people. Throughout the world, they never fought to seize the people. Our line was to fight to seize the people. 1, we took him. 2, we took them. 100, we took them. 1,000, we took them. And so on, until we fought for and seized the people from Phnom Penh too. This then goes on to describe a number of examples, the first being Banam in 1973, Banam town, where it says that they expelled the ethnic Vietnamese, the ethnic Chinese, the military, police, and everyone else. Then there's another example in relation to the Chandler II battle. And then after that, we have also the example of Udong, where people were pulled out. Are you familiar with this phrase that this revolutionary flag is referring to, of seizing the people?
Yes, I am. And it really means simply controlling the population. You don't have to control territory, you have to control people. And they say, you've just read, throughout the world they never fought to seize the people. Well, that is exactly what the Chinese communist tactics were all through the Chinese Revolution. So it was hardly something that the Khmer Rouge discovered.
When I was in that first passage that I read, they seem to describe a series of these events of seizing the people, culminating in Phnom Penh and seizing the people from Phnom Penh. Is there any relationship? Is there a continuum between these events as far as party practice or policy or line that was being implemented?
I would hesitate to read too much into that. I think it's you often find in documents of this kind that to explain what they are trying to do, they depict a succession of events, first 1, then 2, then 4, then and so on.
You said yesterday that, and I think this is in your book as well, that Udong was considered as a good example of seizing the people or evacuating the people. Am I reading too much into that as a sort of a precursor, a test run? Is there a connection between that and what happened in April 75?
Pipun, who, as I said, was my principal source for that, was very adamant, very convinced that it was the success, in his terms, of what happened at Udong, which convinced the leadership that this was the way they should go with Phnom Penh. And the time sequence, early 74, Udong, and then the meeting at Miak, where the final decision is taken, at least is consonant with that interpretation.
Thank you. Now we're going to move through the rest of pre-evacuation rapidly, I hope. There is one event from 1974 which follows the evacuation of Udong that I wish to take you to at page 261 of your book, English ERN 00396-469 and French 00639-792. You're describing a trip to China by Khieu Samphan, and you say the following: Khieu Samphan went to China to meet Mao, the first Cambodian communist to do so since Khmer in 1952, and then set out with Sihanouk on a 2-month-long tour of Grunk allies in Africa, Asia and Eastern Europe. The aim was not merely to build support for the future Khmer Rouge regime, but more importantly to ensure that the Prince's commitment did not waver. Can I ask you to expand on how you reached that particular conclusion, that the aim of this trip in part was to ensure that the Prince didn't waver?
I think it's a continuation of what we were talking about earlier, this balance, which was clearly in all their minds when they brought Sihanouk back in 1973 to visit the liberated areas. On the one hand, keep his support. On the other hand, don't let him acquire too much popularity. And 1974, yes, they still very much needed Sihanouk as an international image for their movement, and the trip to Africa, through Africa and Asia, was partly to win more support, to convey their message to other countries, but more than anything else, to keep Sihanouk tied to the movement. Now, if you're going to say, where do I draw that conclusion from? I basically have to tell you that's my interpretation of what it was about. It's consistent with what went before and what went after, and to me that is the explanation.
That's helpful, thank you. During that trip, we have documents that report parts of that trip on the case file. I'm not going to be giving you this exhibit in the interest of time, and it's, again, I wish to move to other topics. But a document that is on the case file, number 12.7, this is a Nouvelle du Cambodge, Kampuchea Information Agency broadcast from the 11th of April 1974, reports a speech by Khieu Samphan that he gave during his stay in North Korea on the 10th of April 74, in which he essentially said that the forces, Khmer Rouge forces, were making significant advancement, or forces of the front, I should say, and that they had liberated Udong. I just want to ask you whether you're aware of that particular speech in the context of this trip.
I don't think so. No, that didn't cross my screen.
That's fair, thank you. As we move forward into early 1975 and the actual preparations for and the evacuation itself, I want to ask you a few questions actually about the events of the 17th of April and following. I'll skip some of the preparation questions simply because we haven't got a lot of time. Looking at your book now at pages 269 to 270, you're describing the entry into Phnom Penh by Khmer Rouge forces, and this is at Khmer ERN. I apologise that we don't have Khmer ERNs for this, so it's English 00396-477 278 and French 00639 802 to 3. There are a couple of points that are of interest here at the bottom of 269 and top of 270. We've already discussed the attitude towards those who had, as you said yesterday, voted with their feet. You say here that now they were prisoners of war and everything they possessed was legitimate war booty. Shortly before the final assault, division commanders from the southwest, the east, the special zone and the north had ordered their troops not to loot or to kill unless they met with resistance. Can I ask you there if you have been able to research this aspect of the attack, the degree to which these orders were coordinated, that they were issued, you seem to be suggesting, to different zones by various commanders. Are you able to enlighten us on that further?
All the descriptions of the evacuation of Phnom Penh and indeed other sources seem to agree that the individual zones had quite a lot of latitude in how they carried out the evacuation. That soldiers from the eastern zone, for example, tended to be more lenient than those from the southwest, from the south, from Tam Ox region. And certainly that was the pattern right the way through. Different zones, different policies, different individual lieutenants, sergeants, whatever, low-level military cadres behaved in really significantly different ways, just as village chiefs and cooperative chiefs would also later be very different in their policies.
Thank you. And just picking up that point, at page 275, the upper half of that page, English ERN 0039648 and French 00639 and this is after a discussion of the actions of the different zone forces. You say the following, quote, "But it was a difference of style, not of policy. Once the evacuation order had been passed down, Eastern Zone units, like everyone else, ensured that the areas under their control were emptied of inhabitants." Is that right, that despite the variations, everybody implemented the order?
The policy was the same, the implementation was different. So yes, it happened everywhere, but with very significant differences in how it was carried out.
Another aspect of the evacuation that you describe in your book is the killings of Lon Nol regime officials, and you describe this in relation to a number of areas. So I'm going to start with Phnom Penh. At page 271, and I'll give the ERNs, English 0039647 French 00639 804 to 5, you say the following, quote, "At the Hotel Monorom, a few blocks south of the railway station, where the Deputy Front Commander Khoi Tun established his headquarters, a committee for wiping out enemies was set up. Its first action was to approve the execution of Prime Minister Long Bure, Lon Non, and other senior Republicans who were taken out and killed in the grounds of the Cercle Sportif, not far from the Information Ministry, where they had been detained." Can I ask you first whether you've been able to ascertain in your research who established this committee?
I'm afraid not.
Do you have information as to who was in that committee? You describe it as being based near Khoi Tun's headquarters. Do you have any further information as to who was in it? Or is this as far as we go on that particular fact?
No, there are areas which there is no documentation about, and nobody who was privy has spoken, at least not to me.
Can I read another passage to you which relates to people, evacuees from Phnom Penh, and the treatment of Lon Nol officials? This is at page 273. The relevant ERNs here are 00396-481 in English and 00639-807 in French. And this is the particular passage that is of interest. This is evacuees from Phnom Penh. Quote, when the column reached the northern zone checkpoint at the village of Prek Nu, army and police officers from second lieutenant up and government functionaries were asked to come forward and identify themselves. They were informed that they would be taken back to Phnom Penh to help Angkar reorganize the city. That was indeed the destination of the most senior among them, including the former Premier, Hang Tun Hak, and another ex-minister, Pan Soti. Both men were taken to Khoi Tun's headquarters at the Hotel Monorom and then killed. The rest was simply led across the rice paddies into nearby scrubland and bludgeoned to death. So that's a rather gruesome account, but my question is, do I understand correctly that we discussed the committee at Khoi Tun's headquarters and now this second group being sent? Are the two related in any way as far as you've been able to ascertain?
The decision to send back Hang Tung Hak and Pan Sotir was certainly laid down from the highest level, no question. The decision, likewise, to kill officers and officials above a certain level, I think one may assume was on the basis of a central instruction, but would be implemented. The exact level and who was killed would be decided by the zones. However, I think it's worth adding that there was an awful lot of latitude for the people who were actually doing this, and I don't want to go in and get in advance of myself, but I'm struck by the interview I did with a perfectly ordinary soldier who was one of a group who were searching houses in Phnom Penh afterwards, and they'd been told to go round and make sure that there was no one hiding, and they found various old people who had been left behind by their families and were still in flats. What did you do with them? We killed them. Did you have instructions? No. What else were we to do? The climate, the mindset was that such people you killed.
You do describe a degree of variation on the page that precedes the one we just looked at. I may need to correct myself. Rather, this is at page 277. And the ERNs there are in English 00396-485, and French 00639-812-3. That's just for the record. You do describe there the killings in, I believe, Battambang and Pailin, and you describe a degree of variation. Based on your research, nevertheless, in areas at least that you've considered, was there killings of people from the former regime from a certain level up? Was there a particular consistency that you've been able to infer based on what you said must have been a centrally devised decision?
there was a pattern all over the country of killing former Lon Nol officers, whatever their level, and of killing officials, former Lon Nol government officials, above a certain level. I think in the case of the officers, the military men, it was much more systematic. For the civil servants, there are very large numbers of cases where individuals either escape the net or escape the net for a period of time, or for one reason or another were able to get through the whole Khmer Rouge period, having been quite highly placed. So it was not, if it was systematic, there were gaps in the system.
And just on that, at page 275, you deal with the issue of the death toll, and you look at other events in other countries where there was large death toll as part of revolutions, etc. This is English ERN 00396483 and French 00639810810 to 811. Just a brief passage there. Quote, you had described the example of France in the months following German retreat, and then you say, quote, but in France, the killings, the forced suicides, the shaming of women who had shared their beds with the enemy were the work of individuals acting alone or in mobs. In Cambodia, it was the result of a deliberate policy decision taken by the country's highest authorities, POL and the CPK Standing Committee. Do you still stand by that conclusion?
Yes, I do, and I'm glad you raised this because yesterday Judge Laverne asked me whether there was anything that I wished I had not written as I wrote. And indeed, the estimate I gave for the number of dead in the killings after the Second World War in France was inflated. It is in some French sources, but I said 100,000. I think it was nearer 10,000. It's minimal relevance to the court, but that is the belated answer to Judge Laverne's question.
Another aspect of similarities and this issue of variation that you deal with in the book deals with actual forced movement of people. This is at 276 to 277, English ERN 00396484 to 5, and French 00639811 to 2. Here you're describing the events in the following days, April 18 and following, with Son Sen being in the city. And you describe how one of his first acts was to summon the division commanders from all the 4 zones to delineate clear limits for each sector. And then a little bit further down the page, you say the following, quote, new guidelines were also issued to harmonise the evacuation procedures in different parts of the city. No longer could people choose for themselves which road to take. Those in the north went north, up Highway 5, even if their home villages lay in a quite different direction. Those in the west were marched along Highways 3 or 4 towards Kampot or Kampong Spew. Those in the south towards Takeo or Svay Rieng. The entreaties of husbands and wives or parents and children who happened to find themselves in different parts of the city were ignored. They went the same way as everyone else in their sector. Searchers were stepped up for those trying to stay behind. The old and bedridden were simply killed. Similar scenes with local variations occurred all over Cambodia. Quite a few important facts there. But if I can start with what you seem to be describing as a harmonization attempt to have a more systematic procedure. If I got that right, that from this point onwards, a decision was made centrally and then implemented to move people in different directions depending on where they were, if that is research that you've been able to ascertain.
Yes, one of the problems was that the different zone commanders had never actually worked together before because their zones had been separate, they had been a law unto themselves, and when they all came together in Phnom Penh, they butted up against each other, their troops. So rules had to be laid down pretty quickly how they should cooperate, and it was the first time they'd had to do that. You can see that it's certainly the beginning of a harmonization, and the beginning of a unification of the policy towards those being evacuated.
Now, one fact you discussed yesterday, and you discussed the reasons for the evacuation, so I will not go there, but you discussed the issue, I believe, of people being told not to take a lot of possessions with them. And I want to just touch on that briefly. At the bottom of page 287 in your copy, Mr. Short, and English ERNs 003964995 and French 006398256, you describe the condition of the deportees, and you say the following: most of the deportees had reached the countryside empty-handed, Khieu Samphan explained, adding with evident satisfaction, quote, the few belongings they were able to carry with them will be worn out within 2 or 3 years. My copy is not clear on this, so perhaps you will correct me. I'll just finish reading the rest and then you can correct that passage. Indeed, it had been to limit the amount they could carry with them that people had been ordered to leave at such short notice in the first place. But in all public pronouncements, these strategic aims were passed over in silence. So my question is, first, if you can perhaps read for us that passage. In my copy, the words are completely unclear. And then if you can tell us whether that statement that is attributed to Khieu Samphan reflects the policy or the blind that you discussed yesterday about telling people not to take a lot of possessions with them.
Yes, the relevant portion reads, most of the deportees had reached the countryside empty-handed, Khieu Samphan explained, adding with evident satisfaction, the few belongings they were able to carry with them will be worn out or used up within 2 or 3 years. Yes, that was the logic of it, that if you took very little with you, it would be worn out, and then you would have the same as everybody else. This was part of the program to separate people from their belongings so that everybody became equal, because if everybody has nothing of their own possession, then they are all the same. And indeed, very short notice to leave, they couldn't take that much with them anyway. So it's all completely consistent.
You then continue on in the next passage. Quote, thus the new regime began with a lie, and lying would remain one of its defining characteristics. After April 1975, nothing the Cambodian leaders said could ever be taken at face value. They lied to hide unpleasant truths. They lied because they could not be bothered to remember what had really happened. They lied by mistake, by accident, out of laziness, or for no discernible reason at all. The lie became an instrument of rule, enveloping policy in a miasma of uncertainty, secrecy, and dissimulation. Can I ask you to expand on that conclusion as to the regime's lies?
It's a very harsh judgment, but I stand by it. It was a deliberate decision, quite consciously, to portray the world of democratic Kampuchea other than as it really was. And there are innumerable examples. I mean, when Pol Pot went to Beijing, went to China for his first official visit, and he gave a long speech about democratic Kampuchea, he said, I remember, I was there when he gave it, when it was broadcast, everyone in Kampuchea has 312 kilograms of rice per person per year, and so on and so forth. Lies, as I said, sometimes there was a reason, sometimes the reason was simply not comprehensible, but lies were in the very fabric of everything the regime did.
Thank you. I'm now going to actually move on to the policies as they existed post the immediate event of the evacuation. And as an entry point to this, I look at page 280 here, and the relevant ERNs are in English 00396-488, in French 00639-817. And you say the following: the evacuation of Cambodia's towns and its immediate consequences, the relocation of the entire population to the countryside, the killing of former opponents, the reform or elimination of all regarded as potentially hostile, were an almost perfect paradigm for the 3 years, 8 months, and 20 days of Khmer Rouge rule that followed. That most city dwellers were taken completely by surprise merely showed how little attention they and the outside world had paid to the Khmer Rouge and their methods during their long years in the wilderness. What happened in mid-April 1975 was the fruit of policies that had been in gestation since the 1960s and had their origins in a still earlier time. So there are two slightly distinct points being made there. But can I ask you first to elaborate for us, if you could, on this idea of the evacuation itself and its immediate consequences being an almost perfect paradigm for the rest of what followed?
Well, I think the basis of that thought is that is the ruthlessness and single-mindedness and the lack of concern for human values, for human suffering, for individual values that was shown during the evacuation. Later on, in the collectives, exactly the same attitude prevailed. What the Khmer Rouge wished to do was to achieve a given goal, whether it's the removal of millions of city dwellers to the countryside, the creation of agricultural cooperatives, collectives, which are capable of producing a particular level of rice yield, the building of irrigation works. In everything, the same approach, and in many cases the same finalities, that is, large numbers of dead along the way, were how those programs were characterized. And you find all that in the very first step, which was the evacuation of the cities.
And if I can bookend this concept with another quote and see whether this is also relevant. This is now at page 399, which is at the very end of your description of the toppling, the fall of the regime and the escape from Phnom Penh of leadership, including Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Khieu Samphan, etc. And this is the part I was interested in. English ERN 00396-607 and French 00639-976. And it's the following passage that I'm interested in. Quote, Khmer Rouge policy right up to the last hours remained wholly consistent with everything that had gone before. The priority accorded to getting Sihanouk to safety, to protecting Pol and the other leaders, was merely the practical application of the principle expounded by Nguyen Chia months before. If we lose members but retain the leadership, we can continue to win. The corollary, that ordinary people were expendable, had been Khmer Rouge practice ever since the evacuation of Phnom Penh in April 1975. Am I correct in reading those two passages together and understanding them to be describing the same conclusion?
Yes. The key line is ordinary people are expendable. But I would point out, following from what we discussed earlier, where we talked about the need to seize the people, to remove the people from the control of the enemy and have the control themselves for the Khmer Rouge, those are in total contradiction. There were times, most notably when they were struggling for power in 73, 74, when they understood that they needed the people with them. For reasons which are very difficult to understand, the moment they were in a position to actually gain power, and they had power, they lost interest in retaining the people. The people became expendable. They got what they wanted, and people were no longer the concern in the same way as they had been earlier.
And if I can pick up the other part of the first quote that we read in relation to events of mid-April 75 being the fruit of policies that had been in gestation since the 1960s. Can I ask you to expand on that? Is that similar to what we were discussing this morning, the gradual incremental development of policy, etc.?
Yes, there are the two strands. We talked earlier about the Isarak strand and the returned student strand. When I said the origins were even earlier, I was thinking of the Isarak. There are distinct similarities in the way the Isarak operated and the way the Khmer Rouge operated. And indeed, they have many of the same leaders. And then from the 1960s, the returned students who had taken power in the party brought their ideas, and this incremental process, which we've discussed, continued.
Thank you. You've discussed already, I believe, this concept of a first modern slave state, and that appears in a number of places in the book. And I just wish to read one part, because I'm interested in the concept of a slave state, a single entity, if you like. This is at page 291, and the relevant ERNs are in English 00396-499, French 00639-831. And in elaborating this concept of the slave state, you say the following, second half of the page. Like true slaves, the inhabitants of Pol's Cambodia were deprived of all control over their own destinies, unable to decide what to eat, when to sleep, where to live, or even whom to marry. And that part you've already explained for us. A little bit further down, though, you say also this. It is also true that the way the new system was interpreted varied hugely from zone to zone, region to region, and even village to village. In some areas, cadre were lenient, in others harsh. But in both cases, the people, the slaves, had no say in the matter. They merely endured whatever degree of leniency or harshness the upper levels decided to met out. So can I ask you to expand on that, because you are using the term slave state as a single entity, and then of course with variations within it. But you do seem to be describing, if I have you correctly, a system that in a way emanates from the top. And if I have that wrong, I'll ask you to correct me.
It did emanate from the top. It could only have emanated from the top because the underlying principles were the same everywhere. Everyone, the overwhelming majority, because there was always a tiny group who were exceptions for one reason or another. The leaders, those high up in the party, certain very privileged workers had a greater degree of freedom, and so on. But really 99% of the population, the overwhelming mass, were all slaves, in the sense that they had no choice over any aspect of their lives. Now, if everyone is a slave, yes, some may have good masters who are a little bit more kind. Some may have particularly harsh masters, and that corresponded to the leaderships in the different collectives. It wasn't zone by zone or even region by region. You could have villages, collectives 5 kilometers apart in the same zone, the same region, where conditions were very, very different. It really did stem from individual leaders, but whether the leaders were lenient or harsh, the fundamentals, the existence as slaves, were the same.
Thank you. Now, looking into what you describe as the approach to the economy, which of course is a part of these policies that we're discussing, and this is the passages start at page 293 and then they continue on page 294. The relevant ERNs, English 00396-501 to 2 and French 00639-833 to 835. You say the following, quote, "The first step, the destruction of the feudal elite, which for centuries, in the revolutionaries' view, had exploited the country for its own ends, had been accomplished by the communist victory and evacuation of the towns. The second and third step, to build and defend," in Paul's phrase, meant mobilizing the entire nation to develop at breakneck speed in order to prevent Cambodia's sempiternal enemies, Thailand and Vietnam, from taking advantage of its enfeebled state. This last consideration was crucial. And then just over the page, there is a quote that begins with the following. First your introduction and then the quote, which I think is attributed to Pol Pot. "The economy was just another battlefield to be conquered by brute force." And then the quote, "How must we organize our action? It is the same as in war. There we raised the principle of attacking wherever the enemy was weak. The same goes for the economy. We attack wherever the opportunities are greatest. We must prepare offensives for the whole country. We learned from the war. If the command was strong, we would win. If the command was not strong, we would not win. The same goes for building up the economy." Can I ask you to expand on that, what appears to be in your description a rather militant approach, or if I'm using the wrong word, you'll certainly correct me, you're the expert, but the use of brute force, to use your words, in relation to the economy, if I can call it that.
I'm not sure how much I can elaborate. In the early stages of the Soviet Union, with war communism, there was not a similar approach, but they were trying to go extremely fast. Stalin's industrialization program was much the same. There are precedents for this. And above all, when a country, a communist regime, feels itself under intense external pressure. And there's no doubt that democratic Kampuchea did find itself under very strong pressure, or did feel itself, particularly from Vietnam, much less from Thailand. And that leads to a kind of paranoia, where the ends justify the means. Any means are legitimate, which will allow you to achieve rapidly the end you want. That said, yes, external pressure, but after the victory, with the arrogance and the hubris which the victory had brought, Cambodia, I think it's Ieng Sary, said, we are going down paths that no country has been before. So there was that belief that they could do impossible things, and therefore it meant they could push the population to do impossible things, with the results that we have discovered.
Can I ask you to opine on whether or not this fear, if I'm describing it correctly, of Vietnam in particular, whether that was a dominant consideration in the decisions to implement these policies, apart from hubris, etc.?
I think it was crucial. It certainly was the justification for running as fast as they could, while the Vietnamese, in order that the Vietnamese couldn't catch up. Yes, I think it was extremely important. It provided the context in which no one was going to quarrel, even if they had dared to quarrel, but no one was even going to think, well, maybe there was another solution. Everyone was agreed they had to go extremely rapidly.
I want to read to you a passage from Khieu Samphan's book that you looked at earlier, the chapter 5, that's translated into French and Khmer. E3/16 is the number. This is at English ERN 00498-302, Khmer 00380-497 to 500, and French 00643-909. I will say first, this does cover the issue of what I think you describe in your book as a sort of a undeclared race in April 75 in relation to the attempts to liberate Saigon on the one part and Phnom Penh on the other. So with that background, this is what Khieu Samphan says, quote, if the Vietnamese had liberated the South before Phnom Penh had been liberated, there may have been major danger. Having outrun them once, after liberation, it was imperative to run again. There could be no hesitation. This is why Pol Pot saw the expansion of high-level cooperatives throughout the country had made the revolution in Kampuchea 30 years faster than the cooperatives in China, North Korea, and Vietnam. And then on the next page, a brief quote, were it not for the organization of the cooperatives, Kampuchea would have had to suffer all the consequences of the situation in Vietnam, including respecting the 1973 Paris Agreement between Vietnam and America. Is that reflective at all of this concern that we've been discussing about Vietnam?
I think the first part certainly is reflective, reflects the concern about Vietnam. The fact that they conquered Phnom Penh before the Vietnamese got Saigon put them, in a sense, ahead, and yes, as you said, they had to keep running. That reflects the paranoia about Vietnam. The second bit about the 1973 Accords, the Americans, Kissinger and others, tried to push the Vietnamese very hard to get the Cambodians to sign off on those accords. They refused to do so. I don't think it was because of the cooperatives. It was because they had enough military strength to carry on without, carry on by themselves, to carry on the war against Lon Nol, regardless of what happened in Vietnam.
Thank you, the prosecutor and the expert. The time is now appropriate for a short break. We will take a 20-minute break and return at 3 p.m. Court officer, could you assist the expert during the break and have him returned to the courtroom at 3 p.m. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រងជើង